Narcissistic abusers eventually self-destruct and ruin their own lives. They can't stop themselves from choosing compulsive behavioral patterns because they have very little self-awareness and refuse to face themselves. They can't face who they really are under the mask, so that keeps driving the same karmic loops over and over and over again like a wind-up toy that just can't stop itself. It's helpful to recognize that not all energy vampires are narcissists, but all narcissists are fundamentally energy vampires. This means that narcissistic abusers gravitate towards good energy sources, and the best sources are usually unhealed empaths who have similar wounds, but a commitment to love and integrity, which is what makes their energy so desirable to narcissistic energy vampires in a way they don't generate for themselves, because different choices equal different results. That makes the ending to their story seated in its beginning. Because the empath who is committed to integrity egocentrically doesn't assume people are usually lying or wearing masks, they have blind spots and imperfections too, and they can definitely lie to themselves or when they falter in their integrity, but it's the consistent commitment to their integrity that makes their energy desirable to the narcissistic energy vampire. The vampire masks using their relationship and the integrity of the wounded empath as a mask and cover for their own lack of scruples and boundaries to other people. We see the institutions do this too, where unscrupulous organizations use the integrity of their best members as a mask for the operation. I'm specifically thinking of the LDS Church here, but other organizations and corporations do this too. They hide the seedy stuff that they do by bringing out their brightest, shiniest representatives who are there in good faith and who are there in their integrity as a model, but they also don't recognize the depth of what's going on behind closed doors. So yeah, that's kind of messy. But the narcissistic abuser thinks the empath is a naive fool for having integrity, kindness, and quote-unquote weakness for loving people, because they egocentrically believe most people lie all the time too, and the fools who don't deserve to be lied to. But here's the thing. We live in a paradoxical universe. It's the liar who naively traps themselves eventually in the tangled web that they weave. They lie circumstantially on the fly to get out of temporary binds, and it works for a while. But those lies build up and begin to contradict themselves, especially in comparison to their actions. It is absolutely unsustainable, as well as incredibly stressful. Once the lies start to snowball and the cracks in their credibility start to reveal themselves. Whereas the person committed to telling the truth as best they can has a lightness in knowing they don't have to overthink what to say or what they had said or what this person might have heard from someone else. That's what Mark Twain meant when he said, if you tell the truth, you don't have to remember anything. It makes managing your own energy very economical. People who tell the truth don't have to worry about their actions being incongruent with their words. They don't have to worry about any of that because being committed to their integrity makes them consistent by default. While it might make them more manipulable initially, once they see the big picture and the true intentions behind the masks, they're in a much more powerful and advantageous position. They have time on their side from several different angles, as well as the emotional regulation of knowing they don't have to overthink what to say. And that groundedness, being that well regulated when things are stressful or when there's conflict, it only lends more to their credibility. Whereas the liar starts to sweat and panic, and they start making their lies more and more messy and convoluted because they're trying to tailor it to the person they're talking to in that moment to convince them in that moment. And they're not thinking about the long-term ramifications of getting all messy. Narcissistic abusers think empathy, kindness, and ethical standards are a weakness, despite the fact that those qualities are also the foundation to lasting relationships and allies, and also their ability to function relies on those who continually demonstrate those behaviors to them because they're fundamentally codependent. It's so weird that they're so disrespectful to what they need and what they aren't themselves. It's really weird. They cannot survive without a source to feed their ego, their energy, their ever-festering egoic wounds that they'd rather magnify and enable than heal, while also slowly destroying their access to those benefits and the people who do provide them in their repeated disrespect of those qualities and that emotional labor. The thing is, if the empath heals, which usually involves a breaking point where they finally see the narcissistic abuser's intentions clearly as premeditated and deliberate instead of just the behavior of a broken person who's trying in earnest to be better, they will often drop the abuser cold and use that experience as a catalyst for healing the wounds that foster that initial magnetism between us. Because there is a magnetism between the empath and the narcissist in having the exact same complementary wounds that are founded in the same environment and the same kind of trauma. They just manifested them in completely opposing ways, which is what makes them fit like a puzzle piece until the empath sees it for what it is and decides to put their integrity into their healing and taking care of themselves. While that isn't an easy process, it turns the healed empath into someone much more balanced and incredibly strong, because they've learned to turn inward and apply their gifts of healing to themselves, especially their codependent wounds, instead of pouring that precious energy into the bottomless pit of the narcissistic energy vampire. They turn their wisdom and resilience into superpowers that a much more naive and foolish perspective considers soft or weak. The ability to choose love, to persevere, to hold one's standards and right their wrongs when they make them means the healed empath lives free from the restraints that narcissistic abusers bind themselves in, as within, so without. When they're trying to bind other people, right, they end up just tangling themselves up in their own mess. Because the narcissistic abusers use masks built on lies to maintain their lives and access to people and resources they've conned their way into exploiting. The burden of maintaining those lies over time becomes excessive because they have to keep track of the differing lies told in several different situations. It's not sustainable because they're thinking about getting through this moment, this lie, and they neglect to consider how that will need to be twisted down the road to accommodate the truth, which comes to light with time through people's actions, not only their words. As the evidence of their actions not matching their words comes to light, it also illuminates how incongruous that is to the actions of the person who has maintained their integrity. Once the light starts to shine, it's really obvious that they are opposites, even though the paradoxical nature of this universe sometimes makes opposites look like the same thing or make something look like it's opposite. But once it fully comes to light, you can see it for more of the black and white starkness that it is, instead of the shades of gray illusions that narcissists try to use to cast that confusion over, that haze on, so that they can get away with their nonsense. The healed empath knows that integrity might require more discipline in the moment, but over time, it's much easier and more sustainable because the healed empath doesn't have to remember lies, doesn't have to front or mask, and their actions match their words over time, which shows who they really are without having to use hollow words to merely tell, right? When you show something, that has substance behind it. When you just tell something, words are cheap. Words are so cheap, especially when you're talking to a narcissistic abuser. They'll say and spin whatever they think you need to hear to get them what they want right here, right now. Choosing narcissistic behavioral patterns seem like an easier shortcut at first, but with time, they eventually reveal themselves to the people closest to them who will leave them if they're committed to their integrity and health. And it's that commitment which makes them prime source material in the first place for the energy vampire. So that's an ending that's written before it even starts. But in devaluing and dismissing the values and attributes that make the empath a valuable source to them, they also set the scene to lose access to other future sources once their lies reveal who is actually under the mask. Once the mask cracks, it's really hard for them to get it back. Even when they meet new people, it's never quite the same. It doesn't fit the same way. There's a stink about them that people can see. Once it comes loose and undone, it never quite goes back the same way. It's almost like their Pinocchio nose. Once it's popped out of that shell, they can't put that toothpaste back in the tube. It's really interesting to watch. If you've seen that, let me know below, because it's fascinating and it's so interesting how these patterns perpetuate so consistently. It really is like a computer program, or I can call it a computer virus, because it's uncanny how they do almost the exact same thing. They follow the same patterns. They might have their own little ways of doing things their way, but the overall patterns are exactly the same. are so predictable with time. When you see multiple ones, it's fascinating. It really is like an army of drones. Okay, for their mask to come off, for all of this to come to the light, it can be frustrating and difficult because sometimes it can take several years to unfold. They usually get a few decades of getting away with this before it all comes crashing down. I've also noticed that pattern. The more momentum there is behind it, the sooner it happens. So like if like a 20-something narcissist, 20-something-year-old narcissist has a lot of momentum, like fame or something behind them, that will fuel their downfall faster, because fame and money and different things like that are energy, it's just momentum. So it magnifies what is already there. So if you're on a crash course for like a narcissistic injury and a huge downfall, that will happen younger, usually. But for the more normal, everyday person, it usually takes a little longer because there's not quite as much momentum and buildup behind it. It's like how Abraham Hicks says, like, if you crash into a tree at 5 miles an hour, it's not as big a deal as if you crash into a tree at 60 miles an hour. So it takes longer for that to play out and be as obvious as it is. But the downfall is exponential, and they never fully regain the hold they built on those false foundations, since their credibility to build using other people's resources and energy without the capital of their own integrity is completely dismantled by their own repeated patterns of destruction. They eventually get themselves shunned from all their old sources. So, that is to say, you are precious, you are worthy, and you are loved. So don't invest your energy into places where it is not valued, magnified, and reciprocated. Invest it into yourself and your growth, because they also have access to that. And just because their fountain is clogged and messy and ugly doesn't mean they need you to fix that. They need to fix it themselves, and you'll just mess yours up trying to take responsibility for them. And yeah, that's it for today.